Friend, as you know, we are having discussion on political thought. We discussed the various political thought this week, but today we are shifting somewhat, and we'll talk about the women's rights as human rights. And you all know today is the day of women, so this topic is more appropriate for the today discussions, and we'll come to know how the women movement come to center stage the world over, and also in India, you know, feminist movement and others. Movement started by the women and others to assert their right to get something and participate in the different program and decision making, and you have heard the word women empowerment. So what this all about, so we will come to know in today's lectures, and for discussion on this very topic we have in studio Dr. MP Singh, a senior political science thinker and have been professor of Delhi University, has taught many years, and presently also involved in writing on different political issues. So on behalf, I welcome Dr. Singh for EduSet lecture on this very topic, women rights as human rights. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Amarendraji. My discussion today would be on feminist thought and framework of laws and conventions that have developed on this question. Men and women equally partake in humanity by virtue of their birth as human beings. So, initially one would think that there is hardly any point in talking about women's rights or feminist thought, because human rights is common for men and women, and political thought is common for men and women. That would be a common assumption, but despite this fact, there has developed a need for feminist thought, women's movements, and a series of national conventions, national laws, international conventions and laws, and so on and so forth. Now, incidentally, Sigmund Freud, the Austrian or European psychoanalyst who pioneered in the new science of psychoanalysis, a study of human personality. Sigmund Freud is said to have thought that anatomy is destiny. The difference between the anatomy of man and woman is considered to be very significant in this thought of Sigmund Freud, because Freud said that anatomy is destiny. Now, this initial thought of Freud has of course been questioned by others, because the anatomical difference or difference in the procreational function of men and women is not such a consequential difference. If you probe deeper, gender is a social construction. Difference between the two sexes, men and women, the biological difference between the two would appear to be rather incidental, or one might even say superficial, because what is really consequential, what is really significant is the social conditioning of the two sexes. Boys and girls are nurtured or reared differently, with different sets of expectations, different sets of values, different role models, and it is this conditioning or upbringing. It is this difference in upbringing or social conditioning that makes men and women different. So, one of the earliest points that feminist thinkers, one of the most elementary points that the feminist thinkers make is that gender is a social construction and sex or biological difference between the two is superficial. In fact, in this context, one could refer to a philosopher of science of Indian origin who is now in America. The Indian American philosopher of science by the name Roy Bhaskar has written a series of books on philosophy of science, and Roy Bhaskar has postulated, has argued that their any phenomenon that we study is a multi-layered entity. Any phenomenon that meets our eye is a multi-layered reality, and he talks about three layers of any phenomenon, three layers in any phenomenon we watch or see. The first is what he calls empirical level, the second is what he calls the real level, and the third is what he calls the actual level. So, any phenomenon exists at three planes or at three levels. Sex or biological sex, difference between anatomical difference between man and woman, biological difference between man and woman is an example of what Roy Bhaskar calls empirical level of reality, empirical difference between the two, what meets the eye. Empirical in philosophy or philosophy of science means what can be studied or observed through sense organs. Through sense organs we see, hear, touch or watch or experience certain things, and the first level of experience is empirical through sense observation, direct observation. So, sex in the biological sense is the empirical layer of the phenomenon. The second layer, the real layer of reality in this case, in case of sex or difference between man and woman, is the structural difference or the structural differences in terms of family structure, in terms of structures of society, various institutions of society, in terms of educational differences, in terms of differences in property institutions. So, family, property, education, employment, these structures of social reality constitute the real level of a phenomenon, and in this case Roy Bhaskar would say that social conditioning through which gender differences are created between a boy and a girl or a man and a woman is the real level, structural level, deeper level of reality. Empirical level is the superficial surface level of reality. Real level is the structural level of reality, and the third level of reality that Roy Bhaskar talks about is the actual layer of reality. And when he talks about actuality, he talks about the desirable transformation and change that should be brought about. So, the actual level of reality refers to possible desirable changes that should be brought about. Like for instance, it is desirable that difference between a boy and a girl should be abolished. It's a desirable object for society that difference between the sexes, discrimination or difference between the female and the male must be abolished. So, because it is exploitative to maintain these differences, it is an exploitation of the female sex, it is exploitation of girls if we perpetuate these socially constructed, unjust, inegalitarian, exploitative institutions, and therefore, actuality or actual level of reality refers to the possible and desirable transformation or change that should be brought about. Now, I would make another point here. In feminist thought, one term that you will come across invariably, repeatedly, is the concept of patriarchy. In feminist theory, patriarchy is the central concept. Patriarchy, pitri sattatmak, pitri satta ya patriarchy is the most foundational concept in feminist thought, and for every discrimination, for every denial that the female sex is meted out with is attributed to patriarchy, unjust patriarchal authority. And patriarchy is something which is not typical of the paternal, or it is not typical of the male dominated structure of the society. Patriarchy as a value becomes very pervasive. Even the mother, not only the father, but even the mother subscribes to that value. Even a sister subscribes to the value of supremacy of the male, supremacy of the father, supremacy of the brother. So, patriarchal values become so deeply ingrained that not only men, but even women subscribe to it. They are become they become conditioned to it, they become conditioned into it, they become nurtured into it, part and parcel of their personality it becomes. So, is it possible to talk about patriarchy in the same way as one talks about economic determinism in Marx, or psychodynamic determinism in Sigmund Freud? In Marxist thought, economic structures are the most basic structures. All other structures, social structure, political structures, a structure of law, a structure of a state, a structure of morality. So, all other structures, social, political, cultural, are ultimately derived from the economic structures, ultimately determined by the economic structure. It is the economic structure that is the most basic structure. Material forces of the society are the most important forces, and material forces or economic structures shape and condition all other structures. A state only reflects the political institution of the state, law, morality, they all reflect the basic power of economy, basic economic power of capitalism, or basic economic power of feudalism. The mode of production, the factory system, the mode of production owned by the capitalists, they are the most basic structures that determine what would be the political structure of a society, what would be the legal structure of a society, and so on and so forth. That's the Marxist idea. I'm trying to give an exposition of what Marxist theory subscribes to, what Marxist theory believes in. So, is patriarchy something similar to economic determinism in Marx? Can one argue that in feminist thought there is patriarchal determinism in the same way as psychodynamic forces in Sigmund Freud, psychodynamic forces in psychoanalytic theories are the most determinative factors? According to Sigmund Freud, libido or the psychodynamic force is the basic factor that determines personality and culture. Personality and culture of a society, personality and culture of a period of history is determined by the libido or calm. If you compare Freudian concept of libido with Indian thought, we can refer to calm in the ancient Indian thought. Purushartha is a four-cornered or four-element concept, dharma, artha, kama and moksha. So, in Purusharth, calm could be compared with the concept of libido in Sigmund Freud, and there is libidinal determinism in Freud as there is economic determinism in Marx. Can one argue that there is patriarchal determinism in feminist thought? Going by the current literature of feminist thinkers, going through the feminist writings, one gets the impression that at least in the present stage of feminist thought, patriarchy takes something of the same role which we find in Marx. Importance attached to economic determinism in Marx and psychodynamic determinism in Freud. These are comparable to patriarchal determinism in the contemporary feminist thought. But my contention would be that like other determinisms, this patriarchal determinism in feminist thought is also open to question. I also question economic determinism in Marx, because economic structures are important, but they are not the sole determinative factors. In addition to economic factors, at certain stages of history, political factors also matter, and even followers of Marx of a later generation, the neo-Marxist thinkers have revised Marxism to argue that at certain historical junctures, a state can be an autonomous institution from its class base. Marx thought that the state is always the handmaiden or the tool in the hands of the capitalists, but neo-Marxist thinkers argue that at certain historical junctures, a state can be an autonomous institution, if not a totally autonomous, at least relatively autonomous from its class base. And similarly, I would also like to argue that psychodynamic determinism in Freud appears to be exaggerated a bit, and in the same way as economic determinism is exaggerated in Marx, similarly patriarchal determinism in feminist thought may be open to question, and I would argue that maybe historically and at the contemporary time, patriarchal domination is a very oppressive force. It has been a very oppressive force. When we hear about the judgments of the Khap Panchayats, it appears to be highly objectionable, obnoxious in terms of misuse of patriarchal power. But at the same time, what I am trying to argue is that with reforms in society, with institutional reforms, economic reforms, with social, economic and political changes, it is possible that institutions, patriarchal institutions, are already undergoing changes, and the impact of modernity, impact of modernization, impact of education, impact of economic equality in society are transforming the structure of patriarchy, and possible desirable changes are already evident in certain sectors of society. And therefore, the point I am trying to make is that maybe at present juncture it is necessary to talk about feminist rights, it is necessary to talk about women's rights specifically, but gradually as society becomes more and more egalitarian, more and more equal, feminism may gradually merge with humanism, and humanism would subsume feminism. Of course, that may not be just around the corner. It may take time, but the possibility cannot be totally denied. Now, there is no denying the fact that the present period, contemporary world is highly unequal, and there is a need for a strong dose of feminist reforms. Feminist movements and feminist ideas are not irrelevant today. Consider a few facts, and this point would become clear. In the world today, despite women notionally forming 1/2 of the population, women are notionally more or less 1/2 of the population. Despite this proportion in the population, in the world today, fewer than 5% of heads of governments are women. Fewer than 5% of heads of governments in the world today are women. Less than 10% of parliamentarians are women. Less than 10% of members of parliaments around the world are women. The rest are all men. Women are more vulnerable to social discrimination, no doubt about it. Women are more subject to violence, domestic violence as well as social violence. They suffer more in times of communal riots, they suffer more in times of war. So, women are an exploited or discriminated lot, there is no doubt about it, and it is in this context that feminist thought and feminist movement is relevant. Now, another point that I would like to make here is that there have been inequalities in society based on other criterion other than sex. Like for instance, there is racial discrimination, there are discriminations on the basis of ethnicity, discriminations on the basis of religion, discrimination on the basis of language, discrimination on the basis of political creed, and so on and so forth. So, sexual discrimination or discrimination in terms of men and women is not the only thing going around, but what differentiates sexual discrimination from, say, racial discrimination or social and economic discrimination, religious discrimination is this. Other modes of discrimination, other bases of discrimination have been more easily attacked and more easily reformed. State action, intervention by the state or intervention by governments and states has brought about many reforms. Economic equality has been brought about, racial discrimination has been significantly reduced in the world, even in countries like United States of America, where racial discrimination was once rampant, in countries like South Africa, where apartheid was widely practiced, sanctioned by law. So, even in those countries, racial discrimination, racial differences have been significantly reformed, significantly reduced. Economic equalities have also been brought about. Religious discrimination has been reduced through state intervention, through secular state policies, multicultural state policies, and so on and so forth. It has been more difficult to eradicate discrimination based on sex. One of the reasons why is this so? One of the reasons responsible for it is that in liberal democratic theory, as it developed through the 18th centuries, 18th and 19th and 20th centuries and down to the present, liberal democratic thought made a distinction between the private sphere and the public sphere. Family or relationship between man and woman or family affairs are supposed to be the private domain, and through much of the career of liberal democratic theory, through much of the practice of liberal democracy in the world, this idea was generally maintained that the private sphere should be immune from state intervention. A state should not interfere in private affairs, family affairs, and it is in the family, it is in the private sphere where discrimination based on sex was most rampantly or is most rampantly practiced, and therefore, a state was allowed to intervene in racial discrimination, but the state was supposed not to intervene in private spheres, and that may be one of the reasons why it has been more difficult to abolish sexual discrimination than it has been in case of discrimination based on ethnicity, religion, race, political creed, and so on and so forth. So the point I would like to repeat is that in the world today, when we talk about human rights, when we have stated human rights, everything is not stated. After having stated human rights, after having advocated equality, human equality or equality in terms of human rights, there is need to specifically talk about women's rights, because feminists argue that the laws that only talk about equality of men and women are not enough. Laws that are gender blind in this sense that law is blind in terms of gender discrimination. Law does not discriminate between men and women, and the law talks about equality of the sexes. That, according to feminists, is not enough. Unless and until you add a rider, unless and until you add, you make an additional point after having talked about human rights, you also talked about women's rights, and you in fact make a special argument, you make a special plea for women's rights. In fact, in certain cases, you must go beyond equality and make reverse discrimination, a special provisions for protection and promotion of women's rights are needed. Even a thing like reservation for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes and OBCs is an example here. As a special provisions for reservations are needed in those contexts, so also in the context of sex, in the context of difference between men and women, also it may be necessary to provide for a special protection for women, reservation for women. That is the point that the feminists emphatically make. On the basis of what we have witnessed in the world, in the India today, in relation to women's emancipation, in relation to promotion of women's rights or promotion of equality between the sexes, we have seen or we should be emphasizing two-stage strategy of actualization of sexual equality, two-stage strategy of promotion of women's rights. The first stage has been easier to undertake. The first stage has more easily come to pass. Equality in political and civil rights, for example. A law is made that men and women are equal, they have equal rights under the law, they have equal political rights, equal civil rights. Educational institutions are opened, or their doors are open for boys and girls both. Public employment, the doors to public employment are opened to men and women equally. In this domain, there has been possible to make some advance. When I went to school in my village, I did my high school, middle school, primary and middle and high school in my village. I studied up to high school in my village. I matriculated in the year 1958. There was not a single girl student in those schools in my village when I was going to school. All boys, the primary school, the middle school, the high school were all boys' schools. Recently, I went back to my village, and all these three schools are there. In addition, there is a girls' school in the village. In addition, there is an inter college in the village. In addition, there is a degree college in the village, and I was invited to speak to the college. I was invited, for an address to the students and the faculty. I noticed, I was amazed that how my village has become transformed over the decades since the days I studied in school there. More than 50% of students in the two colleges, degree college and the inter college, more than 50% of his students were girls. This was an amazing transformation that I witnessed. Today, you go to any office, you find that a good number of employees are also women. So, equality in political rights, equality in civil rights, equality in educational attainments, equality in education, equalities in public employment has been easier to achieve. There are disparities still there. I am not saying that a perfect equality has been achieved between the sexes, but there is a good degree of progress there. Where progress is less possible or less effective is in the structure of property rights. Equality in property has been more difficult to achieve between men and women. Laws have often been amended. Some laws are still loaded against women. Not all laws, and laws in not in all religious communities. As you know, in India, the constitution of the country desires a common civil code for members belonging to all religious communities, but so far, and it is one of the objectives of the directive principles, it is one of the directives of the constitution to the governments in India to bring about common civil code for all religious communities. It has not been attained so far, because the approach of the government is that the idea of reform or proposal for reform should come from the religious communities themselves. A Hindu code bill was introduced in the parliament by the Nehru government, and Hindu family law has been reformed, property law has been reformed. Even there are some inequities, but so far as family law, Muslim family law for example is concerned, no reform has been possible. Approach of the government is that let the community itself initiate the reform or come forward with the reform, and then the government will make a proper legislation. You know, that situation or that policy is highly detrimental to women, because most religious laws, most religion based family laws are highly inegalitarian, discriminatory of women, loaded against women, and it is in this realm that progress of equality of sexes has been least progressive or has been least effective. There is some progress, no doubt, some laws have been reformed, but a lot more laws are yet to be reformed to make them gender just. Gender justice is urgently required there. Now, the next theme that I am going to discuss is feminism in individual thinkers. We could talk about feminism at various levels. First of all, feminist thought has developed in individual political thinkers. Individual feminist thinkers have formulated their ideas on gender justice or gender question. Then a second level of discussion here could be national declarations. Various nations have made declarations on human rights. These national declarations could be then briefly discussed, and we could conclude with international conventions, declarations by the United Nations or Vienna Convention, various other conventions convened by the General Assembly of the United Nations. So, these are the three possible levels of ideas relating to human rights, women's rights as human rights, that we should be discussing briefly. Given the constraints of the time, we would be brief. Now, three waves of feminist thought have come to pass. If we review the literature on feminist thought, we can differentiate, we can distinguish, or we can categorize feminist thinkers into three possible persuasions, into three possible categories. The first, or I call them three theorems of feminism, three theorems of, or three hypotheses of feminism, or three theorems of feminist theory. The first is what has been called the sameness theorem of feminist theory, sameness theory. There are feminist thinkers who have argued that men and women should have same rights, same liberties, same opportunities. So, this group of feminist thinkers has emphasized similarities between men and women. Important thinkers in this persuasion, in this school, are the early British thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft, a British lady who published a book, A Vindication of Rights of Women, in 1792. In the year 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft published a book called A Vindication of Rights and Women, in which she argued that men and women should have the same rights and the same, they have the same needs, they have the same requirements, they have the they are the same species, and therefore they should have the same rights and the same opportunities and the same conveniences. Another British thinker in this tradition is John Stuart Mill, the great liberal political thinker. John Stuart Mill wrote a book on the subjection of women in 1869, and he also makes more or less similar arguments in this book. Then in the year 1974, an American feminist thinker by the name Betty Friedan published a book called The Feminist Mystique, a book published by Betty Friedan, an American, in 1974, can also be put in this category of feminist thinkers, arguing for the sameness argument, making an argument for sameness of rights and opportunities for women. The second school is what has been called the difference theorem of feminist theory. I call it the difference theorem of feminist theory. In this category of thought, the political thinkers or the feminist thinkers have argued that they have emphasized differences instead of emphasizing similarities. They have emphasized differences between men and women. Some of these theorists have emphasized, even gone to the extent of advocating the conventional idea that men and women have different natural aptitudes, they have different inclinations, they have different psyches, and therefore to an extent these differences are conducive to human development. But the more emphatic argument in this difference theorem is made by theorists like Sula Smith Firestone, the theorist feminist thinker called Sula Smith Firestone, who published a book, The Dialectic of Sex, in 1970. Another important theorist in this tradition is Mary Wetterling Bragin. Mary Wetterling Bragin, who published a book, Femininity, Masculinity and Androgyny, a Modern Philosophical Discussion. Now, these feminist thinkers argue that men and women they have different conditions, they live in different conditions, they have different anatomical and social conditions, and to an extent there may be need for difference of approach. For instance, some of these theorists have advocated instead of heterosexuality, which is the dominant value in society, they have often gone to the extent of rejecting it, and they have preached lesbianism, they have preached androgyny. That androgyny, the Hindi word for androgyny would be uhalingi, and the Hindi word for the Hindi word for lesbianism would be samlingi among women. So, they have even defended lesbianism, they have defended androgyny in order to protect themselves, because the condition of women, anatomy of women is such that they become victims of male domination in relation to procreation, in relation to family responsibilities, and therefore they have even rejected the dominant sexual value.
Sorry to interrupt. We have a question from Bihar.
All right.
Please ask your question.
सर, आजकल जो बीमारियां फैल रही समाज में, उससे हम किस तरह से छुटकारा पा सकते हैं?
फिर से सवाल पूछिए, आपकी आवाज साफ नहीं आ रही है।
हाँ सर, मैं बोलना चाह रहा हूँ कि आजकल जो हमारे समाज में तरह तरह जैसे मलेरिया हो गया, टाइफाइड हो गया, पानी से फैलने वाला बीमारी, उससे हम किस तरह से मतलब कि बचाव पा सकते हैं, कैसे उसका हो सकता है सर?
ये तो आज का विषय से संबंधित प्रश्न नहीं है। ये जब हेल्थ केयर करेंगे उस समय आप प्रश्न पूछिएगा तो डॉक्टर्स लोग बताएंगे, ठीक है? तो बाकी तो जी कंटिन्यू।
ओके, सो इफ देयर आर अदर क्वेश्चंस they are welcome, but in the meantime I will continue my discussion. The third theorem of feminist thought is what I have called diversity theorem. Diversity theorem argues that women's conditions are not simply defined in terms of female gender, rather women's condition is complicated by various other factors such as race, ethnicity, religion, class, age and what not. And therefore, the difference theorem argues that the gender difference is not the only difference that is seminal or that is important in arguing about women's rights. Women's rights are more complicated, or if not equally, maybe even more complicated by factors such as religion and gender, religion and race. In some religious traditions, in some races, in some economic classes, women are particularly vulnerable to exploitation, and therefore diversity theorem of feminist thought emphasizes that so many diverse causes, so many diverse factors complicate the question of women's rights or emancipation of women, that it is a very difficult and daunting task. This argument also verges on some of the theoretical arguments of post-modernity, the complexity because of the diversity of the situation, and therefore, women's rights or the feminist emancipation is so complicated and so difficult because it is not only rooted in the biological difference or gender difference, it is also complicated by factors such as religion, race, ethnicity, class and what not. Now, the second level of discussion, second level at which I would like to discuss the topic today, I would like draw your attention to national declarations that were made in the earlier centuries, because human rights in modern times start from those declarations. I am referring to the American Declaration of Independence made by the Second Continental Congress on 4 July 1776. I am referring to the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen made by the National Assembly of France after the French Revolution on August 26, 1789. I am referring to the Declaration of Rights of the People of Russia and the working and exploited peoples of the world made by the All Russian Congress of Soviets made after the revolution in January 1918. Now, these three national declarations, the American, the French and the Russian, all the three countries experienced revolutions, various kinds of revolutions. For instance, America experienced a war of revolution, France a revolution against feudal monarchy. These are bourgeois examples of bourgeois revolutions, and the Soviet Union experienced a communist revolution. Now, all these declarations talk about human rights, but they do not make any mention of women's rights. There is absolutely no mention of rights of women, they only talk about rights of man. Maybe the argument could be made that man in this context includes women, it is a universal man that is inclusive of women, but the conditions of those times would not be very conditions of that time would not make this argument very persuasive, because those were the times when women were really subject to a great deal of patriarchal oppression. In this context, Karachi Resolution of the Indian National Congress, March 1931. I would also draw your attention to the Karachi Resolution of the Indian National Congress, 1931. Now, the Karachi Resolution appears to be the first early national declaration of rights which specifically mentions rights of women. No discrimination based on sexes, no discrimination based on male and female differences would be permissible or would be allowed. So, Karachi Resolution is the first national resolution. Karachi Resolution of the Indian National Congress is the first national declaration that goes beyond rights of man and also talks about rights of women. Then let us very quickly, because time is very limited, very quickly refer to some international declarations and conventions on rights, human rights and women's rights. Of course, the most important human rights declaration in this category is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights made by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. Incidentally, the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations, was being formulated at the same time as the Constitution of India was also debating fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy in India. So, it is very interesting to examine. In fact, I invite historical research on this topic. I have not come across any historical or political science research that examines the interaction between the deliberations of the United Nations and the deliberations in the Constituent Assembly of India, because both these bodies were deliberating human rights at the same time, and there must have been some exchanges among the personnel, because Sir B.N. Rao, the constitutional advisor to the Constituent Assembly of India, was sent on a foreign trip, and it is recorded that he met the Chief Justice of the American Supreme Court, Justice Felix Frankfurter. He met the Chief Justice of the Canadian Supreme Court, Justice Learned Hand, and then came back to India and reported to the Constituent Assembly on the deliberations or consultations he held abroad. I am quite sure that some exchange of views or some exchange of personnel, people who were also at the United Nations and people who were in the Constituent Assembly of India, some interaction must have taken place. In fact, historical and political science research so far has not given attention to this. It is a worth exploring subject. After the Universal Declaration 1948 of the United Nations, very quickly there are some other important declarations again coming from the United Nations. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights 1966, then International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights the same year 1966, and the most important for our point of view in this discussion on feminist thought or feminist rights, there was also a United Nations Convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. Convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. It was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1979. This is particularly relevant, and this is the first UN declaration that gave a specific attention to women's rights. Before that, other UN documents were more concerned with human rights in general, although they did talk about a basis of equality in terms of human rights on other criteria. In addition to they also talked about equality among the sexes, equality between the sexes when they talked about human rights. But this particular UN convention specifically devoted its attention to women's rights. Now, then very quickly the human rights literature gives impression of gradual evolution of the rights discourse, and in this context 3 generations of rights could be discussed. The first generation of rights mainly concerned themselves, the first generation mainly concerned with civil and political rights. The second generation mainly concerned with cultural and economic rights, and the third generation was more attentive to ecological rights, environmental rights, women's rights, child rights.
Okay.
So maybe we conclude on this point.
So well, friends, with these words we conclude the lecture. I thank all of you, and I also thank you for giving such an insightful lecture. Thank you very much.